Oh, I can't see now. Oh, it's not letting me. Oh, organisers, that's okay. You are an organiser. Phew. I wonder how many will turn up.
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it?
But if we get 30, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
I think we'll get more. Sue from Avon Glen's coming.
Oh, is she?
I mentioned it to them because they were all saying, oh my goodness, what do I need to do? And I said, I've got just the solution for you.
Because I prepared earlier.
Yeah. Oh, talk of the devil. What's she doing now?
I've got a link, no.
Oh, Sue's doing it on Teams. Sue, it's GoToWebinar. Oh. Oh, 24 people are here. Hello, good morning, everyone. Morning to those who've just joined. We'll just wait a few more minutes for those people who are grabbing a coffee or visiting the loo, and then we'll kick off. Okay, I'm going to kick off the webinar now. Thank you very much for everybody for attending. And during the next hour, Steph's going to, well, actually during the next 45 minutes, Steph's going to give you an overview of the Employment Rights Bill with the detail and everything that you need to know and what you need to do to prepare now. So we very much look forward to going through this with you. Could I ask if you've got any questions, can you pop them in the chat? And what we'll do, we've got 15 minutes at the end, so we'd like to go through those questions with you and share the responses from Steph at that time. But in the meantime, we'll crack on, and I'll hand over now to Steph, who's going to go through the presentation.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right, let me just share my screen. Right, so welcome everybody. I think this is probably one of the most debated HR topics for the last 20 years, and so we can't really avoid talking about it. So hence, this is going to be the first in a series of webinars we're going to run on the subject. Obviously, it's a massive topic, and we have only got 45 minutes. So my plan is to try and focus on what I believe is going to be most relevant for most SME businesses. So we can focus on those accordingly. But as Tina said, we've got some questions at the end. There will be more sessions coming, which will do a more detailed focus on different things that you need to prepare for the different elements. But for today, I really wanted to give you an overview of the whole piece of legislation as it is, with your kind of priorities that you need to focus on, particularly for April coming just around the corner. So just a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me. I've worked in HR for 30 years as somebody I know, I think he's on this message, obviously, say I started when I was 10, but I am a fellow of the CIPD, which is our professional body, and I do have an advanced certificate in employment law. I'm a member of the Institute of Directors by exam, so obviously have been a trustee and non-executive director on a couple of boards, and set up Pure just over 13 years ago now. We're obviously a small team based in Southampton, and we support over 450 businesses currently at the moment with their HR, fixed fee recruitment and training solutions. So hopefully, we know what we're talking about and have lots of experience and can bring the legislation to life a little bit and talk about some of the challenges that we know businesses face at the moment, but I think the things that you're going to need to focus on. And again, that's going to be the practical element for most people. So let's talk about where we are at the moment. Obviously, you can't really avoid the news in terms of the Employment Rights Bill or Employment Rights Act. I'll explain the difference between the two. And then I'm going to take you through timeline of events, key milestones, what's already happened, February, April and October this year, and then going into next year, and some practical steps of things that you need to start thinking about and putting into place now. But I think my overwhelming message is don't panic. This is all doable. We've been and had unfair dismissal limits around 12 months before. We've had lots of big legislative changes. I think this is obviously probably the biggest one I've seen since the Equality Act. But we get through them, we change, we adapt, and that's the important bit, is actually that you just put the preparation in and understand what you need to do. So this has all come about basically because it was Labour's pledge before they got into government to create a critical step in what they called a plan to make work pay, effectively, so that they obviously wanted to lower employment rates, get people into work, delivering kind of value on terms of what they were doing. And they created something called the Employment Rights Bill. And on the 18th of December, so just prior to Christmas, the Employment Rights Bill received royal assent. So we became an Act of Parliament, and it's applicable throughout the whole of the UK. So what that effectively means is we now have the Employment Rights Act, so hence the bill to the Act. And obviously it will be dated 2025 because that's when it received royal assent, even though obviously it'll have staggered effects and come into effect predominantly in 2026 and going into 2027. So we are talking a significant change in legislation. I think from my perspective, and this is me being old, we've actually been relatively quiet post-COVID in terms of employment law changes. Certainly in my days, pre-COVID and far beyond, you know, we would have a lot of significant changes in April and September each year. So from this perspective, I think, you know, if you're kind of new to running or newish running a business in the last 10 years, it will feel like a lot, but certainly as businesses have gone through in the past, this is kind of probably the normal pace that we would have had things at before. So my advice now is don't panic. Obviously there is a massive social media storm about all of this, and I'm hearing lots of hype and lots of overreaction in terms of some of the things that you need to do. And I think, you know, that obviously doesn't benefit you as business owners or HR practitioners or finance directors or whatever role you may do. There are some physical changes that you need to make. There are lots of resources available. You need to have a plan. The biggest shift for me with this is you need to train and educate your managers, and you need to embed good people management practices, because if you don't, that is where you're going to get stung. It's all very well having the framework and all the details of, you know, policies and so on, but you need to live, eat and breathe it, and that's going to be your biggest defense should you ever face a challenge in the future. And I think that's the challenge we find for most businesses, is that, you know, they'll tick along quite nicely and then something will hit them as a real curveball, and if they're not prepared, it's really difficult for us to put sticking plasters on and sort the situation out. So there's an element of that preparation that is really important, because it is going to happen. You will get a kind of legal challenge at some point in the future. And if you're prepared, it's so much easier to deal with and to defend accordingly. So we've obviously had the Employment Rights Act 1996. We've now got the new Employment Rights Act 2025, which will build upon those changes rather than repelling most of them. We've had guidance before, the fundamentals of things that we already have, such as codes of practice for ACAS, 5 fair reasons for dismissal, flexible working, all those kind of good things that are in the Employment Rights Act will not change. They are remaining and they will be built upon as we are. The challenge that we have is that the changes really are staggered into 20. We don't have a lot of detail for some of the dates on 2027, but even yesterday we've had advice around some of the consultation dates opening for things like fire and rehire, which you've probably heard about, and some dates, some clarity on dates and one movement of dates, so as of yesterday. So even having written this, obviously it kind of almost instantaneously becomes out of date. So it is a watch this space, and change obviously will keep coming, and there will be lots more information that's available. We are looking at what we call a primary domestic piece of legislation. So this is UK specific. Primary just means obviously we've got an extra piece of law. What that does mean, it's not so easy to then change provision if we have a change of government in the future. So from my perspective, in my 30 years, I've seen unfair dismissal change from 2 years down to 1 year on 2 previous occasions, when we had a Labour government and a coalition government. And we coped both times. But what happened is that when the change of government occurred, it obviously pinged back to the 2-year limit, and that's not going to happen in this case. So obviously we have got that primary legislation. Yeah, right, bear with me a sec. Just had a note from Tina to say that nobody can see the presentation, so that's not good. Let's just reshare. I think we're right. So yeah, the Employment Rights Act. So we obviously have existing legislation, piece of primary legislation on top. We're not really going to see any of this being undone if we have a change of government in the future. So there are some things that have already actually happened. And I'm not really going to focus on those or a lot of the trade union aspects in today's session, because I don't think it will really to have anything. Just out of interest, if Tina can monitor this for me, can we have a show of hands of anybody who actually recognises a trade union for collective bargaining purposes at all?
Nobody so far, Steph. In fact, all thumbs down. So
that makes sense to me. I think in terms of the kind of the clients that we come across, that's not really there. What I would say is this is a perfect storm, a perfect opportunity for trade unions to increase their membership. And I'm surprised they haven't really started knocking on people's doors. Traditional industries, certainly to start off with in terms of manufacturing, but servicing going forward as well, I would expect to see some things happening. So we've already had minimum service levels for strikes removed. And we've got these changes occurring, as I say, yesterday we obviously had an update. So already in place in terms of what's going on. So the first milestone we've actually got clarity on of it now being the 18th of February. So this month, again, I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, all relates to trade unions. So we've got lots and lots of extra protection there around protection, around industrial action, about balancing and so on. So again, just one to be mindful of, that there is some noise. You don't need to worry about anything from the 18th of February if you don't recognise a trade union. But as always, bear in mind, if you carry out a disciplinary or grievance procedure or consultation for any other exercise, employees do have the right to bring along a trade union representative, even if though you don't recognise one. And that's a really common misconception that we see with lots of businesses. So just be mindful of that one. So the changes that I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on are those that are happening in April, and there are some. I've also seen quite a lot of hype about some of these things, so I've kind of put together a bit of a plan on what you need to do just in terms of preparation. So April, we see our usual increase in statutory rates. So we see those every year: statutory maternity pay, statutory paternity pay, statutory sick pay, shared paternity leave. We also see our weekly increase cap, which is how we calculate statutory redundancy pay, and also how we work out what awards would be in an employment tribunal. We're unlikely to see those weekly cap figures until March, but we know that statutory pay changes have already been published, so they're already available. So for instance, we're looking at £194.32 per week, which was up from £187.18 per week for most of the statutory pays. Obviously, you've got the usual 90% bits. I'm not proposing to go through the details of all those pay structures now, but more than happy to have a conversation with somebody offline. And then we've obviously got the national minimum wage rate changes, and they're actually taking effect from the 1st of April rather than the 6th of April. So we've got some quite big hikes. So aged over 21, we're going up to £12.71 an hour. 18 to 20, we've got an 8.5% increase. That's taken us at £10.85 an hour. And 16 to 17-year-olds will see an increase up to £8 an hour. So they're obviously things that you should be obviously making sure from a payroll perspective and other aspects that you've got those in hand. And that's no different to every April that we would see. The bit that we are seeing the fundamental changes are on is paternity leave. So this is now going to be a day one right from employment. So you can literally walk up on your first day and tell your employer that you want to take paternity leave. Previously, you would have needed to have 26 weeks of service to be able to do that. So that's obviously a new thing. It's day one. However, what I would is I'd put it in context in that the other elements are not changing. So an employee will need to give you 15 weeks notice before what's called the expected week of confinement or the expected week of placement. So that's when the baby's due. And so those provisions have not changed. So even though it's a day one right, they'd need to communicate around their request before they joined you, if that made sense. And there's no change in eligibility to pay either. So none of those things are going to change. It's just you're eligible for it from day one. And from a practical perspective, I mean, I think paternity leave does get used. It obviously isn't a particularly generous provision. You could take it in 1 week or 2 week blocks. It's obviously paid at statutory rates. As an employer, you can obviously do an enhancement and make that up to basic pay if you wanted to. If you're going to do something like that, I would always make sure you put it in a policy and set out some guidance around how you're going to do things. But from that perspective, it's a benefit that does get used periodically, not massively. One that gets used less often is actually what we would call ordinary parental leave. So this is also becoming a day one right. So at the moment, an employee would need to have 52 weeks of service to be able to take ordinary parental leave. Now, I remember ordinary parental leave coming in around the time working time regulations and thinking this was going to be massive. And a bit like dependent leave, it's never really grown arms and legs. So it's had changes throughout the years. So currently, if you have a child under the age of 18, you are entitled to 18 weeks of unpaid leave up until their 18th birthday. That can only be taken in minimum of 1 week blocks. You could take less, but obviously you could request less, but you as the employer would do it. It is unpaid. You need to give 21 days notice of your intent to take the leave, up to 4 weeks in any leave year. Your leave year works on the anniversary of the child's birthday or your start date, depending on how that goes. You as the employer cannot say no to ordinary parental leave, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily realise that. You can postpone it for a period of up to 6 months, but you need to let them know within 7 days of that postponement. So none of those provisions are changing. And I wouldn't say we see, it's very, very rare to see people taking parental leave. So again, whilst this is news, I don't see this as a massive thing to be, a massive element to be scared of from our perspective. It's just one of those things, it's tick the box, it's a new provision, you need to know about it, your managers need to know about it, particularly if people are requesting it. Obviously there's more punitive measures if people don't get the postponement or the communication in the right time, rather than actually not being able to take it. And then actually also we've now got this provision whereby we've had the removal of restriction where paternity leave can now be added on to shared parental leave. So again, I'm not proposing to go through shared parental leave, but that's where effectively usually the mother will share their maternity leave with the other parent or partner of somebody who has parental responsibilities, so that they can split that leave between them. So that can now be added on in addition. So again, we've obviously got paternity, so that's an extra 2 weeks you could add on to the 50 weeks that could be moved to the partner. So lots of noise. If you're going to really see a change from this perspective, I don't think this is going to be the one that's going to keep you awake at night. So practical steps you need to think about. If you've got your suite of family leave policies, they are going to need an update. Now, there's no legal requirement for you to have family leave policies. They work for you. We often work on a rule of thumb that says if you're a business of less than 10 people, you probably want a couple of HR policies, and we do a mini handbook that's got things like disciplinary, grievance, social media, bring your own device, equality, diversity, health and safety. If you've got 10 to 15 employees or more, you need a staff handbook. And I can't say anybody enjoys having one of these documents. You know, our basic kind of boilerplate starts off around the 200-page mark. But they are one of those things that if you don't have, and then you end up with a situation, it's really difficult for us to then manage and help your liability around that situation if you don't have policies. So they're not something you need to recite. They're not something you need to know inside and out. They're not something you even need to write yourself. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me how many people kind of will spend days and weeks writing a policy when, you know, you can buy it from a provider from us and we can bespoke it for you to meet your needs based on your sector. But if you have got them, then parental, paternity and shared parental are going to need an update. The biggest thing you're going to need to do is communicate to your managers. You're going to need to tell them about these changes. They need to know what's on the horizon, because they're going to be at the coalface within people talking about it. And let's be honest, you know, come April, this is going to be all over the news. And the biggest challenge we're seeing on lots of other levels is obviously people becoming more educated around their rights, or sometimes not educated around their expectations, I should say, and using AI to kind of find out what they're eligible for. So those communication to managers are going to be really, really key. Likewise, if you've got your family leave policies, just check you've got your neonatal care one and your parental bereavement, because what we're tending to find is whilst they've come in just over 12 months ago, most businesses haven't actually updated those. So now's a good time to go back and do a stock check on what you've got. I would also say, actually, it's as much about making sure you've got the systems in place. So I don't know how anybody functions without an HR information system. We're obviously a Breathe reseller and an Employment Hero reseller. So Breathe, I would say, is really good for up to about 150 employees. Employment Hero, if you want a more sophisticated integrated payroll system. They make your life easier. They can automate these things for you. So you can store documents in them that employees have access to. So you can use it as a portal. You can use them for read receipt functions. So for me, your policies, at least once a year, you want to be saying to your employee, here's a reminder, here's our policies. Can you confirm you've received, read and understood what's in the content of these? Likewise for new starters, and you want to be able to keep those records. You want to be able to look at requests that people have made and have that audit trail to be able to refer back to. So again, an information HR system will help you do those sorts of things. But the one thing I would be saying is make sure you're talking to your payroll provider. Make sure your software is equipped for purpose. Obviously, the providers will be kind of putting these steps in place, but you need to obviously make sure that that responsibility that is yours is ready to go and that you have those steps in place. So for me, the payroll provider, the payroll question is the really big one you need to be talking about. Okay, the next batch of things that's coming in April, and I think probably from the questions I've had from our clients, this is the one they're most worried about, is around statutory sick pay changes. Now, I think there's a lot of noise about this in the press, and I think there's a bit more hype and overkill than there needs to be. So fundamentally, people will be eligible for statutory sick pay from day one, as opposed to currently where you have 3 waiting days, which would be your normal working days, where you'd get SSP from day 4. So the difference is day one. Obviously, we can't recoup it back from the government, so this is a cost to you as an employer. It's not going to be massive. The problems I see occurring probably will be increased rates of sickness absence in those who are in lower paid jobs, because previously they wouldn't have been able to afford to take 1 or 2 days off for a cough or a cold or DMV or whatever it might be. Whereas actually, if you're lower paid, the amount of statutory sick pay is quite significant. Whereas obviously, if you're on a more substantial salary and you're not getting company sick pay, then actually that's not such an appealing option. So we've had that removal of the 3 waiting days. So we've got day one, and that is now going to be paid at £123.25 a week, obviously split between your normal working days, or 80% of the employee's average weekly earnings, whichever is lower. All right, so again, do you see what I mean? It's the people who are probably on national minimum wage jobs, maybe in care, hospitality, maybe some aspects of manufacturing, that you're going to see that people will get payment where they normally wouldn't have done, and that's actually going to make a difference probably to the level of sickness absence you're going to see in your business. We're also going to see the removal of the low earnings limit. But fundamentally, and this is where I've seen some kind of really bad advice going around kind of on social media and LinkedIn and various other forums, the self-certification elements remain unchanged. So if you require somebody, if their shift starts at 9 o'clock and you require them to call in by 9 o'clock and they don't call in, just because SSP is a day one right does not mean that you need to be paying for it. But you need to show that the criteria you have for communicating sickness absence is fair and reasonable, and that the fact that employees were aware of it. So again, this goes back to educating your employees, making sure you've got your onboarding set up, making sure you've got a clear policy that says this is what our policy is, and enforcing it. So, you know, people do still need to communicate with you that they're off sick. If they don't, we treat it as absence without leave, and you deal with the situation differently. We are told that the current fit note process is not going to change. So that would still be a fit note after 7 consecutive days, regardless of the days you work. And as always has previously been the case, you can't withhold statutory sick pay just because somebody hasn't yet supplied you with the fit note. You can obviously chase and ask and give them notice of things, but just one of those things just to be aware of. And things like the link periods that we have at the moment, all those sorts of things, nothing on that front changes. So it is just purely the removal of the lower earnings limit and the 3-day element that are going to be there. So what do you need to do? So this is probably where there's most of your preparation for April. You will need a new clause in your master employment contract, which talks about statutory sick pay, because there should be an element under the Employment Rights Act 1996 that have a list of all the things that you need in your employment contract. So you will need a new little clause, nice and straightforward, which just talks about statutory sick pay. And then you need to obviously think about your position or whether you pay company sick pay as well. You don't need to issue that new employment contract to existing employees. You may choose to communicate the change to them either verbally or in writing, but there's no legal requirement to do that. What I would say is any sick pay policies you've got, you need to review them, need to revisit them. I'm quite surprised I still come across organisations that don't use a rolling 12-month period, that use a calendar year. So, you know, you could take your sickness absence in December, you go into a new calendar year and you get a new entitlement in January. Obviously, I'd make those rolling periods if you haven't got them already, but certainly have a look at them. And, you know, if your default position is to pay statutory sick pay, you can always then enhance it if you choose to. But if you make a commitment to pay company sick pay, you then obviously can't lower that. So that's obviously one of those things to bear in mind. One of the biggest changes I would recommend now at the moment is probably introduction of a sickness trigger point policy. And I think we're going to add this onto our new mini handbook. So at the moment, from a legal perspective, you must have a disciplinary procedure. That's included in the Employment Rights Act 1996. And as always the case, we would always suggest you don't put that in your contract employment. Your contract employment should say we have a disciplinary grievance procedure, and it can be found over here in our staff handbook or in this policy, and it's not contractual, because what you don't want is to then fall foul of not following your own process and end up with a contractual issue. So you want that little clause that just says, I've got a disciplinary procedure, but it's over here. So that a disciplinary procedure would normally be what we would call your conduct policy. So that is your behavioural things. So you turned up to work late or drunk, or you were rude to a customer, or you sabotage something, or you were fraudulent. All those things fall under disciplinary, so conduct. From a practical perspective, and certainly when you start getting to 10 employees or more, we would always encourage you to have what's called a capability procedure as well as your conduct. And that will follow, both of those will follow the ACAS guidance in terms of the steps that you have. They both have a same step process, first written, final written, dismissal. And both of them will have the same provisions of, right to be accompanied, notice of the meetings, right of adjournment, companion rules, right of appeal, all those sorts of things. But having the two just allows you conduct to deal with your behavioural issues, capability to deal with your performance issues. What I would say is I would now add a third policy onto that, and I would add a sickness trigger policy. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Bradford factor myself. Some people love it. I like using sickness trigger points. I think they're much more practical to be able to deal with for most businesses because they give you some guidance. So what I would say is, for me, it's just a reminder. So this is your contract of employment, and if I'm off sick, I'm technically breaking my employment contract. Now, I'm not a robot, I'm not AI, I'm human, and I'm going to get sick. But I think the thing we see is we see definite over tolerance from the employer's perspective around how much sickness absence they allow. So you are allowed to set targets that says, if you trigger over this amount, I'm going to sit and review your sickness absence levels with you. You don't have to live with those kind of levels of sickness absence that can get really excessive. So as a rough rule of thumb, I work on the basis of anything more than 3 occurrences of absence in a 6-month period, or any more than 4 in a 12-month period. You can obviously set what you want. I think anything lower would probably be a bit unrealistic. You do need to think about allowances for those. So if you've got somebody who's got a disability, we'd want to involve occupational health, but typically you allow an extra 20% on that. So that's that 20% on the 3 triggers or the 4 triggers in the 6 or the 12 months respectively. But again, that would only apply if the absence is related to that particular disability. So if somebody's got, quite chronic migraines, they've got a disability, but actually the 4 periods of absence are unrelated to the migraines, you don't need to think about that element. But again, that's what we're here for. You can always kind of come and talk to us about how you do things. So action for you: conduct stroke disciplinary procedure, capability procedure, sickness absence trigger procedure. So that definitely get those in place. You want to make sure your sickness data is up to date. Now, I have to say, even when we work with larger, kind of more corporate businesses, it's when you start measuring sickness absence, you tend to find your sickness absence goes up before it improves, because you realise that most sickness absence is actually going under the radar and people aren't collecting it correctly. So think about your process. Do you need an HR information system that records the information straight in? Things like Breathe, you can upload a fit note, so it's loaded into the system. You can then run reports. So from a business, I'd want to see KPIs around sickness absence. Set yourself a target. I want to see no more than 2% of available working time down to sickness absence, and that should include anybody you've got on long-term sickness absence. And if you're starting to see those spikes, then that's when you really need to start managing it, because you're allowed to. You need to make sure you've got a good occupational health consideration. We do lots of referrals, and businesses are always quite reluctant to refer for occupational health, which for me is kind of, it's a bit of a no-brainer. So if somebody tells you they've got a disability and they're off for that particular disability, I'm going to want to see occupational health. If you've kind of got patterns of things forming, or you've got somebody who's off maybe 2 weeks or more with stress, mental health, I'm going to want to refer to occupational health. It's not expensive if you use a reasonable provider. Obviously, some of the national frameworks can be really expensive, but it is really important, because I want an independent medic who understands the workplace, so not a GP, to tell me officially that your employee does have a disability or they don't, and if so, what reasonable adjustments I need to consider. And the important bit is they will make a list. They will go, these are things you should think about. But you as the employer don't need to implement all of those. You just need to show as a reasonable adjustment that you have considered and then implemented the changes that you can from their recommended list. It is a commercial decision that you can make around what you're going to do. So classic example, we're on the first floor. it wouldn't be a viable option for us to suddenly go and pay to have a lift put into this building. But we do have access to a meeting room downstairs, and we do have ramps into the building. So it's understanding from, if that was a physical restriction, what you need to do. And it's really important that you can document and show what you've considered if somebody does have those things. Likewise, as previously we talked about, you are going to need to check your payroll provisions software to make sure it's ready to cope. But the main thing is just educating your managers. Think about return to work interviews. For me, they don't need to be onerous. You can load the information straight into an HRIS, have a 10-minute conversation with the individual. Because if you actually sit down with them and go, I'm just checking you're okay, this is the third time you've been off in this time period, that in itself is quite powerful to send a message to the individual that they know, that you know how much sickness absence they've had. So it doesn't have to be a long, laborious process, but just that quality conversation that you then document it and keep it, so you know you've got something in place that you can refer back to and go, well, I already highlighted that your sickness absence was quite high, or I asked you if there was any adjustments that you needed following this provision in the workplace. So the next bit, probably for most of you, the first aspect won't take a huge amount, but the second bit will. So collective redundancy protective award. So at the moment, if you fail to consult collectively with a group of people you're making redundant, you could be looking at 90 days actual pay, not capped. That's going to increase to 180 days. To put it in context, we probably only do 1 or 2 collective redundancy exercises a year with our clients. We're looking at any more than 20 redundancies in a rolling 90-day period. So again, if you need some help with that, that's going to be a knock on the door, ask us the question, and we can help you with it. But from a day-to-day perspective, it's not really going to affect you. The elements that you are going to need to think about is a new whistleblowing protection that comes in on the 6th of April in relation to sexual harassment. Sexual harassment will now be considered a qualifying disclosure under whistleblowing law. So think day one right. Somebody joins your business, they report sexual harassment, they're going to get protection if you then dismiss. So that means they're obviously protected against detriment and other provisions. So that's the one for me that you're going to need to think about what you're going to put in place for April. So we obviously mentioned the redundancy aspect. If you haven't got a whistleblowing policy, I would definitely get one. Obviously, we can help you out with one. And you need to set out what people can do, and all our good policies, you need to make sure that you communicate it to employees. They've got a copy upon joining. They're given a regular update when things happen. They're sent a copy every year. So make sure you have that whistleblowing policy so you've got something in place. Likewise, if you've got an employee assistance program, then I would check, because sometimes you might have a whistleblowing helpline that people can call as part of that package. And for those of you who haven't got an employee assistance program, the way they work is they effectively are a package you buy that employees can have access to a 24/7 support helpline online system whereby they can get advice for all sorts of things. The idea being is that if they need help, they talk to this rather than line managers who aren't necessarily equipped to deal with things. So for instance, they've got a party wall dispute with their neighbour and it's meaning they're not sleeping. You want them to be able to resolve that so they can focus on their work and they're more together as an individual. And a sort of employee assistance program can give you those sort of provisions. And they also these days mostly come with 6 to 10 self-referred counselling sessions as well if your employees want them. So if you want details, we obviously refer for Health Assured, and you can have a look at getting employee assistance programs in place. And for me, they're probably one of the most cost-effective benefits that you can get. You're looking at kind of £600 a year all in for anybody up to about 45 employees within your business. So a bit of a no-brainer. They're also, if you ever get a stress personal injury claim, they're one of the ways that you can actually help defend those, because you can obviously say you put provisions in place and it's part of your risk assessment process. The bigger bit is making sure you train your managers in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, and specifically harassment. Now, for me, I think this is a really big risk area. I see lots of businesses who don't really pay attention to this at the moment and then get stung because they don't pay attention. And this is just going to become more important than it's ever been before, really. So as a minimum, you need to make sure that you do some form of sexual harassment EDI training for all your employees. And I would do that at least every other year, if not every year. Now, you might want to think about online training platforms. We're Improve Reseller, for instance. So again, solutions whereby you can just set it up. So employees do a video, they complete a questionnaire at the end of it, it issues a certificate. You've got those training records that you can put into your HRIS. So you've got that audit trail to show that you've done them. And that's great for employees. For managers, they need more. I would do some face-to-face training or some online training that's in more in depth, but you need to have those training records to show that you've taken those reasonable steps to do these things. Because if you ever get a discrimination claim, one of the most successful ways around trying to defend one is you actually what's called mitigate your losses. So you say to Mr. Judge in the Employment Tribunal, well, here's my EDI policy, here's my training records for employees and managers, and these are the steps that I do, and this is how I proactively ensure that there's no EDI issues within my business, because actually it's quite difficult to defend and say a discrimination claim didn't happen. So these protective measures are really important, and obviously these changes in April around whistleblowing for sexual harassment are going to make that even more paramount than ever before. So some other bits, again, I'm not going to focus on these in a huge amount of detail. We've got gender pay gap and menopause action plans, but this is only for large employers. So only if you're over 250, which is the same threshold for modern slavery statements. And they will be voluntary for organisations from April this coming year, but they will be mandatory at some point in 2027. I would always say, as smaller businesses, if you tender for business, you might want to think about doing these sorts of things anyway, because quite often the company you're tendering for will be a large multinational or significantly larger than yourself, and they will be asking these kind of questions along with modern slavery. And we've also seen some changes to trade union reforms, which obviously we know isn't really relevant to most of the people on this call. So, and then this weird random date of the 7th of April, so one day later, we are now going to get the introduction of the new Fair Work Agency. Now, this bit so far is quite light in terms of detail. What we know is there's a new chair that has been appointed. They're going to be able to make robust powers to investigate and tackle employers flouting the law. So the kind of things that we've seen is people not receiving statutory sick pay, not receiving payment, national minimum wage, those kind of things. And that's going to fall under the remit of this new, which is obviously going to be a government body. How this is going to interact with ACAS and other things, I don't know. So that is very much watch this space and see what comes up next. So that's your tranche for April. So that's obviously not far away. So that hopefully gives you a checklist of some of the things that you need to do. Then coming in October, we've got the next batch. Now, the fire and rehire, when I wrote this, was set to come in on the 1st of October, or in October, sorry, we don't have a date for October, in October. And that communicated yesterday that that's now being pushed back to 2027, and it's looking to be lightened from what was there before. From a practical perspective, we don't use it very often. It's quite risky anyway. You're going to need some HR support if you're getting into the, dismissing somebody and then rehiring them on worse terms. I don't think it's going to be a huge issue for SME businesses, but, I'm happy to stand corrected if it's the case. But I would say it's very rare that we get a query around that, or we have to manage that situation. The bit that is going to be more paramount is more steps in harassment. So that reinforces the things that you need to be doing already in April. And we are going to see a return to employers having liability for harassment from third parties. So this is going to be thinking about hospitality businesses where you're dealing with the general public, or you've got people in your workforce who are dealing face-to-face with suppliers, or even, virtually. You're going to need to demonstrate that you've taken all reasonable steps to prevent harassment, all types of harassment, not just sexual, happening to your employees. So this is going to be your audits, this is going to be your risk assessments, this is going to be you thinking about things, this is making sure that you've done your training for employees and for managers around what's acceptable, what's not, what happens if they come across it, and how they're going to manage it. And lots of this is actually harping back to kind of 1996, where we had a kind of infamous case around Bernard Manning, who we had two employees, two black Afro-Caribbean ladies who worked for a De Vere hotel, and he did a stand-up comedy act in a hotel to an all-male party, lots of jeering, uncomfortable situations, and the two waitresses brought a successful claim against De Vere's on the basis that they claim they should have known that the content of Bernard Manning's topics tended to be kind of quite racially driven, and therefore there should have been steps to be put in place to protect them as individuals, and that didn't happen. So they're the kind of situations we're going to see. So, as I say, hospitality is obviously a rife one around thinking about what you're going to need to do to protect people. But if you want to go and have a look from a self-help perspective, then there's lots of really good guides from the EHRC that you might want to have a look at. Again, it talks about all the good practices of talking and educating your staff, assessing your risks, looking at your kind of risk areas, training, reporting, monitoring, and kind of evaluating what you already do. October, we're also going to see some changes for tipping. So again, another one for hospitality. We're going to see employers who are going to need to consult with workers, not just employees, and their representatives for creating tipping policy. And we're also going to see a requirement whereby tipping policies are going to need to be reviewed every 3 years. How that's going to be mandated and managed, watch this space, I don't yet know. The bigger one is going to be the time limits for making an employment tribunal claim. So this is going to increase to 6 months. So currently, virtually everything is 3 months. And this is going to move to 6 months. And we received confirmation yesterday that that's going to now be no earlier than October 2026. So no real kind of change there from what we anticipated, but I think it will come in. The challenge here is you need to think about your documentation. We always say, actually, in our world, documentation is everything. You need to keep that audit trail. So you need to be thinking about, have you kept things? If people have got 6 months to be able to bring a claim and they've already gone after their notice, it could be 9 months after, by the time things work through the system, that you're going to find out you've got an employment tribunal claim against you. And you've got to be able to try and remember what happened before. So, you know, it's thinking about all those kind of good things around keeping your records, using your HR information system to record those conversations, keeping your documents. I would also have a look at your applicant privacy policy if you've got one, which you should be if you're doing your own recruitment, which I probably want to change that from keeping records for 6 months up to 9 months, maybe even 12 months. So again, just a little kind of tick for you to think about. And then just can pretty much whiz through most of these really quickly. Loads more trade union action changes. Public sector outsourcing changes that are coming. So more than happy to talk to anybody separately offline if they want to talk about trade unions. We're going to get a new adult social care negotiating body. So that's one to watch out for if you're working in the care sector. Anybody in the marine sector, we're going to get a new mandatory seafarers charter. And then again, the biggie one, unfair dismissal, protection for unfair dismissal will become a right after 6 months of being in a job. So the big one here for me is anybody who joins your business from the end of June onwards will be able to bring a claim. So you need to start thinking about probationary periods, how you manage those, how you onboard people and how you do things. So we'll come back and visit that in a moment. We're also going to see some changes to pregnancy and maternity, some also to bereavement leave as well. So, as I said, you need to think about who you've got in your workforce. If you've got some problem people that you are avoiding having those difficult conversations with, or you haven't dealt with them yet, now is your time to get on and do this. So end of June this year, going forward, we'll be able to bring a claim in early 2027. So think about going forward as well, your recruitment process and your methodology, because actually making the right decision, which we all know is impossible to tell from a recruitment process, is going to be more important than ever before. So you want to make your recruitment process as robust as you can. So that means training your managers, getting their interview skills up to date, getting them to understand the process, but also think about your probationary periods. I personally would change probationary periods from 6 months down to 3 months. And I'd make sure that I use my HRIS to have regular reviews. So at least you're going to want a review at 1, 2, and 3 months. But you know, that first month, you're going to probably want to check in at least weekly. So make sure you have a good onboarding process that's set up. It can sit within your HRIS. You can tick it off. You can ask the employee for feedback. But you need to train your managers to have those conversations that say, here's a shortfall in performance, or I want to see these sort of things. So think about difficult conversations and keep your records, more than important, more than ever. We've also got 0 hours contract changes. They're going to be coming next year. There's going to be compensation for cancelled shifts, and there's going to be more changes to flexible working. Now, for me, flexible working is one of those things, it doesn't really have teeth as a piece of legislation in its own right. But if you bring it under a discrimination claim, then obviously that's where it's more potent. And we'll cover those in future webinars in future as well. We're going to see more changes to harassment as well, and more changes to collective redundancy. So you can start to see there's a kind of pattern here that's forming around some of those bits and pieces. More trade union changes, and then also some regulation around umbrella companies as well. Again, we'll give you updates as we kind of get more of those things coming forward, because as you can see, there's a huge wealth of stuff that needs to be covered here. From a practical perspective, just to kind of finalise really the changes that we're expecting to see, or the ramifications that we're expecting to see. We are expecting to see an increase in sickness levels within certainly lower paid staff who will be eligible for payment on those first 3 days where they may not have been before. So managing your sickness absence is going to become more important than ever before. And as I said, you are allowed to, you just need to be reasonable, have a clear process, stick to it, manage against it. We are certainly in the last 3 months in particular starting to see more employees using AI to bring claims, to raise grievances against their employers. And the problem is whilst procedurally they're pretty robust using AI, the problem is AI is setting expectations way beyond what somebody would get if they went to an employment tribunal. And then we're having to manage an expectation. That's making things really difficult. So again, having those processes in place are really important. Obviously, we're going to get an increased number of claims. How the tribunal system is going to cope with that, I don't know. It's struggling already, and claims are taking longer, and that's just going to get more. Obviously, the judicial system has been recruiting more judges and more lay people, but you know, physically, there's only so many buildings as well. I do think sexual harassment is going to be particularly kind of more pertinent. We're going to see more things there, but from a practical perspective, we use lots of settlement agreements anyway because we have lots of employers who choose to go down that route, and we're going to start to see more of those as well. So we can help with all of those. We are obviously going to be communicating in the next week or so around some new documentation bundles that we're going to be providing with policies and clauses for your contract. We're going to be putting on some new training processes, which are going to be both virtual, online and face-to-face. So we're going to be doing how to manage probationary periods, managing sickness, absence and sexual harassment. So they're really good for your managers. You know, your first-line managers are going to need to really be up to date with those. We obviously resell Breathe. So if you haven't got a management information system, and you want something that's effective for a small business, then that's a great place to look. And you might want to think about an online learning management system. Again, we obviously sell Improve, which can link to your Breathe account, which you can create playlists of training videos that you want new starters to achieve as part of their onboarding, and also for people to do on a regular basis. So all of those kind of good things are there, and we can help you with all of those. And we will be advertising more webinars going forward in more detail. So I'm more than happy to take any questions that we might have now.
Thanks, Steph. That was absolutely brilliant and really comprehensive. A bit of a whistle-top tour for everybody. I've got some questions, so I'll read those out for you if that's okay. So I won't necessarily say who you're from, but you'll know if you asked it. Is it just the paternity that is a day one, right? Maternity is still 26 weeks?
Yeah, no changes to maternity. Nice and easy.
Good. And do you have to take special measures where a team member has said they have ADHD?
So that's not changing as part of the legislation. What you should be doing now is ADHD is considered to be a disability under the definition of the Equality Act. So just as a reminder, there's 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act. Disability is obviously one of them. The definition of a disability is a mental or physical impairment that has lasted or likely to last for 12 months or more, that has a more than substantial stroke trivial impact on your day-to-day living. So whilst I'm not a medic and I'm not ever going to officially tell you ADHD would be a disability, and certainly that means that you then have an obligation to make reasonable adjustments to the workplace for that person. So at the moment, if you're looking in that space, my advice would be we do a referral to occupational health. We do £200 plus VAT, they're fairly negligible. We ask some questions around what reasonable adjustments we need to consider as the employer. A medic then tells us, and then we say, right, we can accommodate 0.12, we can't do 0.3, can't do 0.4, but we can do 0.5. And those are the sort of things you should be doing already, and that will not change as part of the legislative changes that are coming.
Thank you. If somebody works 10 hours per week at £12.50, do they get the 1, 2, 3, 25?
Oh, I don't know if I can do the maths on the thing. So the lower earnings thresholds bit's been removed. They should get the lower bit, so they should get 80%. Yeah, I can't work out the maths on the moment, but should they get the 80% bit rather than the 1 to whatever it is.
Why do you recommend lowering the probation period from 6 to 3 months?
So at the moment, I would say most businesses have a probationary period of 6 months. The challenge you have is that from a practical perspective, I would say most businesses leave it until 5 months and 3 weeks and suddenly go, oh, this person's not performing. So I think the mechanics of getting into a good practice and knowing whether somebody's going to pass the probationary period at 3 months is much more disciplined and much more structured. And there's nothing stopping you extending that probationary period post 3 months. So you can extend it to 4 months or 5 months, but it gives you breathing space to know that you've done everything and you're more than happy that you've got somebody in place already. So it's not saying you you can't, you can keep it 6 months if you want to. It just helps you, it helps facilitate your internal processes by reducing it to 3 months. And let's be honest, for me, if somebody's really not hitting the mark at 3 months, yeah, I might want to extend it 1 or 2 months, but I want to make that judgment call and cut my losses sooner rather than later.
Okay, currently while on probation, forgive me 1 second, the question's disappeared. Let me come back to another one. What's the one thing you think I must do now? If I don't do anything else, what would be one thing you say I should do?
I suppose if you want to do one practical thing, get your policy sorted. I'd say there's 2: policies and train your managers. Communicate. Okay. I think your managers will always be your weak spot, and if your managers have got a policy to refer to, then that makes life easier.
When do you anticipate the training on effective probation periods happen?
We are writing those at the moment, so we will be publicising those next week and looking to start those within the next month.
Brilliant, thank you. What do I need to include in my EDI training?
You probably need to, if you're going to do a more detailed version for your line managers, but if you're just looking at employees, they need to understand what we mean by EDI. So for me, that's the difference between equality, diversity, inclusion and equity. They need to understand the legal framework. So our course content will talk about the Equality Act. It will talk about those 9 different protected characteristics that are actually covered by the legislation. And then you will need to understand, but obviously how you present that to employees, around the difference between direct and indirect discrimination, and certainly focusing on harassment. A little bit on victimization, but that's people get hung up on the word a little bit, but understanding harassment and understanding that the definition is unwanted conduct is really important, because my threshold is different to somebody else's threshold who's different to somebody else's. And you don't necessarily even need to be on the receiving end of harassment. You could witness it, and that in itself would be unwanted conduct. So that's why there's quite a lot of liability around it.
Okay, thank you. Currently, while on probation, our employees do not receive sick pay. Presumably this will now change.
Yeah, you'll need to include statutory sick pay within that provision. But if you've got a company sick pay scheme, you can still exclude them if you want to.
Okay, I think just one last question, in case there's any more coming through. Can I use AI to do my handbook?
Well, there's nothing stopping you. I think from a practical perspective, the AI will deliver what you ask it to do. And if you don't know what you don't know, the challenge is you don't know whether you've got what you want. So my advice is, if you want a cheap and cheerful and a kind of effective do-it-yourself, yes, but it's going to have holes in it. I mean, classic example was last week, somebody sent me one for a bonus scheme and they kind of sent 4 bullet points. And I was like, but for me, you need to cover all these scenarios. So actually a policy for me would be nearer to 4 pages, because you've got to deal with starters, leavers, disciplinary issues, those on sickness absence, those who change jobs, those who change customers, whatever it might be. So the challenge is with an AI, you will get a generic simplified version unless you know to ask it specific questions.
Brilliant. Somebody's asked, can we have a copy of the slides, please?
Absolutely, they should come out after this session.
Yeah, and I will be sending out a recording of this webinar as well. So if you want to share it with other team members, then you'll have that hopefully tomorrow. I think that is about it in terms of questions. Anybody got any other questions? No, doesn't look like it. So as Steph said, tomorrow, or I said, tomorrow we'll be sending out the video and a copy of the slides, and then early next week we'll be sending out some details of the ways in which we can help and the packages that we are developing. Oh, there's a new question coming. The packages that we're developing. So look out for those early next week. That wasn't a question, actually. It was just somebody saying, great presentation. Thank you very much. Very informative. So that's it from us, I think, unless there's anything else that anybody wants to add.
Thanks all for listening.